So I've put together a revision pack for you for the question Brenda Last, bitch or butt of war's misogyny. The idea is just to give you a couple of A03 quotations, some from the text itself, and just suggest some ways you might want to structure a response that looked at Brenda. I've made this using Prezi, so hopefully it'll look quite good. So first of all, let's have a think about some A03 quotations that are just to do with war. Now, put some things down on that screen for you might not have seen before. Those are just looking at the bits in blue, some quite famous quotations about war and about his view of life. But in the bigger bits that are out there, there's also some interesting looks at how his view of his relationship with Evelyn probably have affected his view of women. If you look at the final quotation on there, his divorce was an event that was to leave deep scars on war's fiction, as well as provide further evidence on how adultery can be bad for marriage but good for literature. War's novel is a brilliantly savage stripping down of the chaos lurking beneath the hard chromium veneer of upper-class England, where adultery is regarded as a smart after-dinner party game. That seems to be quite a useful A03 quotation if you ever are lucky enough to write about Brenda. If we move over to perhaps a viewpoint that I know not a lot of us share, the idea that Brenda is a victim of what takes place in the novel. And I've just put some ideas together there for you. I think the first quotation by Bond is perhaps the most interesting, which suggests that Brenda's a victim of the brittle world of the bright young things. And there's just a couple of other bits and pieces there that sort of suggest that although this is a novel that doesn't seem to like Brenda Last, there's quite a lot about the society that does. So the fact that people used to know them as the lovely Rex sisters, that people seem to be generally on his side, and that generally Brenda Last isn't somebody that is looked down upon by the world. I think the final quotation there by Quinnell is perhaps the most useful one, in that it describes to us the way in which the affair isn't actually a particularly positive thing, the fact that it's a vaguely improper game, which I think is quite significant. Moving over to have a think about other reasons why we might choose to look at Brenda as being perhaps the victim rather than the villain of this piece, is to have a look at actually the character of Tony and the fact that Tony himself isn't a particularly likeable person. And those first three quotations from quite early on in the novel I think demonstrate to you the problems that there are with this character, that he isn't particularly in love with Brenda in any meaningful way, that he's actually very much in love with Hetton as the key thing. The final quotation at the end there by MacDonald I think sums up the novel quite well, quite a critical quotation on the act of Brenda, viewing the whole thing as a nice young Englishman, perhaps slightly indulgent, who's deserted by a worthless wife. Thought it would be worthwhile just having a think about how Hetton itself can be seen as a reason why we perhaps shouldn't judge Brenda too harshly, and that's an image from the film Hetton Abbey. And some of the descriptions that go on here is that when we see the modern world coming across to Hetton, it's actually seen as somewhat as an attack. So when the boiler man arrives, Hetton itself seems to try to attack the modern world, and when Brenda says that we could never live anywhere else, of course, that suggestion that she is somebody that is locked away from the modern world. And that final quotation there from Barnes is something I certainly hadn't thought about, in that the way this novel is structured puts Hetton very much at its centre, even though, as we know, the novel was first of all written to look at it as The Man Who Read Dickens, as the short story to start it all off. However, finally, I think we would be foolish to overlook the fact that Brenda is quite clearly a bitch in this novel, that Evelyn Waugh's whole construction of it is around her being the bad guy. And I think just put a couple of quotations there for you from the text that I think highlight the fact that above all else Brenda Last is somebody that is a very bad figure. So overall, I think we would look at that if we were going to construct an essay on Brenda Last, bitch or butt of war's misogyny, that perhaps our final paragraph would look to be on Brenda as the bitch, but the other two paragraphs could certainly look at perhaps Brenda isn't as bad as we think, and actually perhaps Tony and Hetton itself are part of the reasons for the problems. Thank you very much.